I wanted to comment on today's first reading from the first book of Samuel. Notice the Philistines, or some people say Philistines, that they engage in battle against the Israelites and they are victorious. So in the first battle that is mentioned, it said that 4,000 men of the Israelites were killed in battle. And of course, they're wondering, why has God abandoned them? Why are they losing this battle? And so they decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant because, as we know and as they knew, wherever the Ark of the Covenant was, God was there and God would overthrow all their enemies and deliver them from their enemies. So they're hopeful that the same thing will happen. So they bring the Ark of the Covenant into their camp. And the Philistines, they're aware of this and they're afraid. But nevertheless, the Philistines fight very courageously. And once again, they defeat the Israelites. And this time, it says that 30,000 foot soldiers were killed. In other words, way more than in the first battle, even though they have the ark with them. And not only that, it mentions that the ark of God was captured, which is horrible. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died, it says, but they were killed during the battle or in the battle. So why is it that they seem to have lost the favor of God? They seem to have been abandoned by God, the Israelites. So what is the reason for this? And why is it that even though they had the Ark of the Covenant with them, they were not able to defeat their enemies? So one of the things regarding the Ark of the Covenant is, yes, God was with the people, but if we look at the history of the Israelites as they wandered through the desert, they rebelled against God again and again. And every time they did so, terrible things would happen to them. So the same thing is actually happening here. They were rebelling against God. They weren't really worshiping God as they ought to. And this is why their enemies had the upper hand, why they were losing in battle. And when they decide to bring the ark, it's not because they had real faith in God. If they had real faith in God, they would have lived that faith as they ought to. It was more like this is like a good luck charm. Yeah, we know it's powerful. We know that it's the seed of God, but we don't really worship God as we should. But nevertheless, we're going to bring it. So in other words, they didn't have real faith in God. They didn't practice their faith. They were just using God for their own purposes. And that's not the right attitude to have towards God. So in other words, we need to submit to the will of God, not to use God to grant us our will or the things that we desire. Now, it also mentions, there's the mention of the two sons of Eli. Now, Eli was a fairly holy man, but his two sons were rather wicked. And even though they were priests serving in the temple, they would take the best parts of the sacrifices that were to be offered to God, and they would take them for themselves. In other words, they were stealing from God. They were offending God. Not only that, they lay with women. In other words, they had adulterous relationships. They committed sinful acts. So they too lost the favor of God, and they are the ones who are kind of guarding the ark or in charge of the ark, and the ark is lost, they are killed. So it's kind of like God enacting punishment upon them. And it's kind of unfortunate that we don't get the rest of the story. For example, we know that the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. When I say we don't get the rest of the story, in other words, in the daily mass readings, if you read on your own, if you read the first book of Samuel, all the information is there, which is very interesting. So the Philistines, they held the Ark for 7 months. They kept the Ark of the Covenant for 7 months. And what they did when they brought the Ark back to their towns, they put it into one of the temples for their gods. I think the name of the god was Dagon or something like that. And they had a statue of Dagon, and they put the Ark of the Covenant beside the statue of Dagon. And what happens is overnight, the statue of Dagon falls to the ground, falls on its face. And so the next day, the Philistines, they're wondering, okay, what happened? We don't know what happened. So they put the statue back up. But the next day, the same thing had happened. And this time, the head of the statue of Dagon, as well as the arms, are severed. They're cut off. They're separated from the body. In other words, this god is destroyed. And it's kind of like God emphasizing to them, there shall be no false gods before me. And not only that, but when they had the Ark of the Covenant with them, all kinds of terrible things started happening. They would get tumors all over their body. And they weren't sure, is this really from the Ark or not? So they decided to send the Ark to one of their other Philistine towns or cities, and the same thing started happening there. They send it to another town, and eventually they decide, okay, this is the God of the Israelites, and he's not pleased with us. This is why these terrible things are happening to us. We're going to send the ark back to the Israelites, and they're advised that they should also make some sacrifice of atonement for their sins, because they had taken the Ark of the Covenant. So they send sacrifices, and it's interesting that they get the cattle. And they put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart, and they want to watch how the cattle will go. And they say, okay, if the cattle goes in the direction that they're supposed to, we will know for certain that this was the work of the God of the Israelites. If the cattle go in a different direction, then, well, maybe it was just a coincidence. Like maybe these plagues, these tumors on our bodies, maybe it was just some coincidence or something. But sure enough, the cattle head in the right direction. And so the Ark of the Covenant comes back to the Israelites. And so it's a reminder to us that even though we have God in our midst and that we are close to God, it doesn't mean that we always have the favor of God. In order to have the favor of God, we must be faithful to God. We must live our lives the way that God calls us to. Now, sometimes we think that God has abandoned us when in reality, he has not. I mean, think, for example, in today's gospel reading, we have this account of the man with leprosy. He comes and he kneels before Jesus or bows before him. You know, if you recall, we just had this about almost a week ago. We had it from the Gospel of Luke, whereas today it's from the Gospel of Mark. So it's really the same event, but just a slightly different version of it. And imagine, getting leprosy at that time, because it was believed that if you were faithful to God, everything would go well for you. You wouldn't get leprosy. You wouldn't be overcome by your enemies or all these things, right? So it was seen not just as an unfortunate thing that you get leprosy, but it was seen like, I must have lost the favor of God. Maybe I committed some sin, or maybe my parents. This was the attitude or the mentality. But as we know, just because somebody gets leprosy or cancer or whatever it may be, it doesn't mean that they have offended God in any way. So God is always there. But you see, God is able to bring good out of the bad things that happen. So in the case of the Israelites, they realized, okay, we need to turn away from the false gods and our superstition and our sinful ways. We need to turn back to God if we want his favor for us. Now imagine this leper, he's, thinking he's abandoned by God. He has to separate himself from family and the town that he lives in, and he's just isolated in the wilderness. And basically it's a long, prolonged death sentence, a very painful death that he's going to die. But then he's healed of his leprosy. Now imagine for a moment this man, imagine that he never got leprosy, and he hears about Christ. Maybe he accepts Christ, maybe he doesn't. But even if he does accept Christ, compare that situation with him getting leprosy and being healed by Christ. Who do you think would have more faith? Or which of those two versions of the same man, in which case would he have more faith, more devotion to Christ, more thanksgiving towards God? Obviously by having had leprosy. And you see, the message here is that, yes, sometimes we lose the favor of God because we ourselves sin or turn away from God. But sometimes things happen to us and we complain. We think God has abandoned us, but he hasn't. He's always there. He wants to bring some good out of the misfortune that we are suffering. And sometimes that good will come during this lifetime. But even if it doesn't, it will definitely come in the life to come. In other words, in heaven. In other words, if we suffer during this life, we will appreciate heaven even more. So in other words, no matter what happens, we should always trust in God, and we should always live out our faith to the best of our abilities.